Hi, Ellen. Dave here. We put a ton of work into these electrolytes, and I thought you might value having us just put your present electrolyte through some of the criterion that we've been looking at. Really, it looks quite good, but we've got, I think, a solid case of information here. This might be useful to you. I also think there's a second category of electrolytes that this product does not meet that I want to go over. So I think there's some things we could do to tweak your present product and improve it a bit. And then there's a whole another genre of electrolytes that I'd encourage you to take a look at. We'd be anxious to make whatever that you want to do, including just keeping your product as it presently is. So here's what your product looks like in our analyses table. We analyze all the electrolytes, the sugars that you put in, how much glycine you're adding, which blood buffers that you're putting in, and then what the total osmolarity should be on a calculated basis. If you send the product, of course, we could take a look at what it presently is. We'll send you what it is because we have an osmometer of what our product or our rendition of this would be if you had us made it. And we, of course, also like to look at strong ion difference. And you really look good, as I would expect an electrolyte that you would put together would be. It looks quite good. So I'll get into in a lot more detail on each one of these criteria are, because I realize a lot of CAF people, I didn't until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, really deep dive on electrolytes. I was shocked at how much information there is and how intricate you really can get in this genre. And there's a lot of things I think to think through that maybe you're thinking through. It looks like you are because of the product you assembled, but in case if you aren't. I always like to start with the profound need that there is for electrolytes. And I really think this study is a watershed study, not on electrolytes per se, but on what's going on in diarrheic calves. This Florian Treves, I've never met him before. He's from Germany. Peter Constable is at Purdue, or at least used to be. He was there when Jeff Smith, formerly at NC State, who we spent a lot of time. Renell and I, right before COVID, flew down and paid for Dr. Smith just a day of his consulting time, just to share. Well, these are the papers that we have on electrolytes in calves. Give us some of the ones, maybe the citations that you don't have. We actually exchanged. We both had maybe a little bit of things that either of us didn't have. But he's done a lot of research on his own. We shared our thoughts, and he critiqued them, built upon them. And then we did some research at Mapleview Agra actually on the different leading types of electrolyte strategies as far as blood buffers. We had blood gases measured. Dr. Dave Renau at Guelph helped us set up that protocol. And Dr. Smith actually was a co-author in that paper, and I can email it to you. Not that our research is anything super special. It's just it forced us, as you know, when you do research on a genre and you engage some of the leading experts on it and read all the research on it, it really takes you down the path of understanding the product category a lot better. But getting back to Dr. Treves, Constable, that's who that is in this paper. Treves, Dave Renau explained that he's really one of the leading veterinarians in Europe, but he's kind of quiet. He doesn't do the speaker circuit, but he's published some nice work, and he's highly respected by people that I respect in the veterinary field, calf veterinary field. But the crux of his study was to look at on 1,400 critically ill neonatal calves with diarrhea, why did they die? And he had his team of vet students go out and analyze these calves, measuring. I'll get into this next slide, shows it. But when growers or calf growers or dairies would present a diarrheic set of calves, or have their vet students come out and visit their farms that had these diarrheic calves, they would go through and clinically assess them, doing the classic sort of visual things, lack of suckling reflex, were they depressed and then recumbent, not getting up, eyeball recession, suffering from sepsis or hypothermia, and then also draw some blood and then measure a whole battery of different blood gases. I didn't realize there's as many ways as there are to measure acidemia, many of them beyond the scope of what I understand. But he really found that profound acidemia, low blood glucose, and excessive sodium were the three leading blood gas measures that correlated with death, because after they did these physical assessments and after they measured blood and analyzed that blood, they had 48, the criteria was 48 hours later, did the calf live or did it die? And then they could compare all the data from the calves that lived to all the data in these criterion that came from the calves that died, and then see what correlated with death. And he found the take-home message was that scouring calves suffer from acidemia. And of course, we have to correct it, and that's one of the leading things we need to do with an electrolyte. They also suffer from low blood glucose, and that needs to be corrected too. And a good sound electrolyte strategy can do that, or help do that. And then a third leading cause of death was sodium toxicity, which that one really surprised me. And no doubt electrolytes can contribute to that if you overuse them. Particularly an electrolyte designed for treating calves should really only be used for a set period of time and then end. So I call these the 3 grim reapers of death of diarrheic calves. They are acidemia, low blood glucose, and sodium toxicity. And I would argue that an electrolyte strategy needs to correct all 3. So let's look at the first grim reaper of death for diarrheic calves, blood acidemia. If you look at his data from the TREF study, the blood glucose levels were not that much higher, or that much lower, in the calves that died, but they reached a p-value with that minor difference. So minor tweaks in acidemia cause what that calf looks like on the left, where they start going recumbent, they lose their suckling reflex, they just lose consciousness basically slowly over time, their ability to respond. As far as recovery rates on blood, correcting blood acidemia, there's a really nice Canadian study where calves were challenged with coronavirus, rota and coronavirus, and they definitely became very sick. And then they hit the calves either with an electrolyte with no blood buffer or one with a decent level, 80 milliosmoles per liter of sodium bicarbonate, or one with 80 milliosmoles per liter of sodium acetate. And both of them corrected with really no statistically significant difference between the two. And our studies, the one that we paid for and did at Mapleview Agra, with Dave Renaud at Guelph involved as well, found the same thing. Both of those blood buffers, we didn't go quite that high. We were at 50 milliosmoles per liter, but they both generated full recovery. All the calves that were diarrheic that were treated with electrolytes from either of those 2 blood buffer sources corrected the blood acidemia. And I like this next study over here too. This is one that was done, I believe, at Purdue, and Jeff Smith was involved. I think Constable was involved as well. But you can see that the calves, they were induced with diarrhea, and they definitely got the intended result of diarrheic calves. And then they were either fed a sodium acetate containing electrolyte or lactated ringers. And they actually found that blood acidemia was corrected a lot better with the acetate containing electrolyte compared to the lactated ringers. And also blood glucose levels were increased when you fed the electrolyte that of course had some dextrose in it, and the ringers have little or none of that, so consequently there's no effect there. They did note that the IV fluids did hydrate the calf more quickly. The plasma volume went up more quickly, but it really wasn't that much different. In other words, the sodium acetate containing electrolyte also corrected the plasma volumes. So really that was the only benefit you could give it. You got a little bit faster plasma volume being replaced. In other words, fluids being replaced if you IV'd fluids, but the sodium acetate containing electrolyte was very similar. I think this is important because as I've spoken with a lot of leading veterinarians out there who deal with the bigger calf-focused veterinarians, and many of the calf growers view that are familiar with administering lactated ringer, that's kind of the gold standard to treating a diarrheic calf. It's your most assured way of making sure they live. But of course, nobody likes to administer one. They're expensive. Many staff can't do it. And so I think it's really interesting that an acetate-containing electrolyte could actually perform as well as a ringer. But there's also the concern about the gastric bactericidal barrier. In other words, the calf is really designed with a low abomasal pH to prevent Salmonella and E. coli proliferation. But there's lots of data, and I'm going to slide right through this. You're welcome. You can stop at each slide and read each slide if you want. But I'm going to build the case here because it's quite well proven in, first of all, some work that Dr. Smith did. The sodium acetate containing electrolyte, it only raises that pH above 5.5, which, of course, that's where if you get below that 5.5, you can prevent proliferation of Salmonella and E. coli. And if you get down even lower than that, then you, of course, can kill Salmonella and E. coli. So you're leaving the door open, so to speak, longer in a 24-hour period if you use a sodium bicarb containing electrolyte. You could see there that Smith's study showed that 2 brands that used bicarb as their blood buffer resulted in 35 to almost 44% of the 24-hour period having a pH above 5.5, which that's a big drawback for a sodium bicarb containing electrolyte. And as you know, your product is built around sodium bicarb as the blood buffer. The bicarb, it actually lowers the pH in the abomasum, and then that gets into the bloodstream and corrects blood acidemia. But sodium acetate, it's actually absorbed, and then its blood buffer is released in the liver. And so that's how acetate does this. Now, this is some Texas Tech work that Mike Ballou and his group did. It gets very, very detail oriented, but the bottom line, and I'll show you this slide, he compared bicarb versus acetate fed shortly, I think with or without the milk replacer, just to see what the effect was on this abomasal pH, because of course feeding milk replacer also increases and of course the calf has to have milk replacer, but that too increases the pH of the abomasum, and that's unpreventable because we have to feed a calf. But he just wanted to see what those differences were, feeding it as an electrolyte alone, or feeding it, maybe it was right during or even with the milk replacer. And in this slide here, these get really busy, so they're well beyond what I could maybe do in this presentation to explain orally to you, but you can read it yourself. He captured abomasal fluid, and so then inoculated that abomasal fluid that was subjected to these 4 treatments, milk replacer or no milk replacer, electrolyte with acetate or electrolyte with bicarb, each way in a 2x2, and found that the E. coli did proliferate if you used bicarb in a bicarb electrolyte. So here's the pros and cons of each. Both are equally effective in correcting blood acidemia. So your product now, as it presently stands, with using primarily sodium bicarbonate, is every bit as good as the sodium acetate one in correcting blood acidemia. Bicarb is also less expensive. That's a plus. It's also much easier to work with in formulation. I'm going to show you some pictures of what a sodium acetate containing electrolyte can look like powder when it meets heat, and and it creates some of the worst looking, crappy looking stuff I've ever created in our plant. But we have figured out how to do it so that nasty reaction doesn't occur, and I'll get into that at the end of the presentation. And lastly, though, sodium acetate does have a benefit over sodium bicarbonate in that it doesn't raise the abomasal pH above a level that can kill salmonella or prevent its growth for a very long period of a day. So it's much stronger preferred in that regard. So here's how yours stacks up. Our electrolyte analysis chart again, when we lock in at your label rates, 3.5 ounces of calf rescue in 2 quarts of electrolyte solution. You've got a high rate of 71.5 milliosmoles per liter of total blood buffers that are added, of which most of it's coming from sodium bicarbonate. The next grim reaper of death from Treff's study was inadequate blood glucose levels. And you can see there, if you look to the bottom right, that this was a pretty big difference in milliosmoles per liter in the blood of glucose in the survivors versus the non-survivors. The osmolarity in 4 ounces, which is what we typically like to recommend in 2 quarts of solution. If you've got low osmolarity sugars, you're going to be down near 304. If you replace about 25% of some low osmolarity sugar with dextrose, you're going to be at 422. Yours is like up around 500, I think it was. If you go old dextrose and you don't have as much electrolytes as you have in the solution, you can get up to around 600 milliosmoles per liter. I always like to think of how blood, and I explain to growers even when I get thrust in front of them by a customer, that blood and whole milk are similar at 300 milliosmoles per liter. So when you're trying to cross the brush border, of course, they can just go both ways. You have osmotic balance. And seawater, I always like to explain to them, is either 1,000 or 2,000. It's way up there high. And of course, that's why, I mean, as a kid, when you're told, gosh, you'd die if you're out on the ocean, if you had to live drinking seawater, you just couldn't make it. It would actually dehydrate you. I never understood that until I started deep diving on electrolytes as to how or why that happens. And of course, it just has to do with osmolarity. And so it's kind of a ideally, you'd like to have 300 milliosmoles per liter for the electrolyte solution, so it's rapidly absorbed. But if you did that, you're not going to be able to raise blood glucose levels. So you have to strike a balance. Yours is, let's see, at 180, milliosmoles per liter of dextrose, and your total osmolarity is around 522. So you have a high level of dextrose in there. You could consider increasing this dose up to 4 ounces and get some more dextrose into that calf, but you're sitting pretty good really where you are. The last one, the third Grim Reaper of death, is the toxicity that can occur from sodium. And I always think of Janusz Sawinski, the former owner of Animix. He was a veal guy through and through. He came and started Animix when the veal industry was at its zenith here in the US. And he explained how sometimes when you had high sodium whey, you could cause sodium toxicity. The calves would actually get diarrhea. They would just slowly build up sodium in their body. And, they're feeding, these crazy amounts of powder when they're particularly feeding grain at that time to veal calves. They were getting up to like 120 ounces a day of milk replacer powder, like 6+ pounds of milk replacer powder. That's all the calves got towards the end of their grow out when they're around 500 pounds body weight. And so if you had a high sodium ash, you could cause this phenomena of sodium toxicity. And there's going to be a bunch here that, again, I think this presentation is going to get longer than you want to maybe look at this, but I go through in the next few slides why sodium is needed. I think that's something that you probably understand without me explaining it to you. And also what levels of sodium hit hypernatremia. You can obviously stop this and read this if you want to, and what happens with hypernatremia. And then I think this is interesting view this as maybe a resource if somebody says there's too much sodium in our water, or there's too much sodium in our milk replacer, or what kind of intake and what kind of depletion rates are there. And again, for the sake of this presentation getting too long, I'm not going to go through this. And same with this one. You can get high levels of sodium in water, and yet still you're not really hitting that calf with all that much sodium. Kind of surprised me when I actually did the math. So what we recommend to prevent this hypernatremia being exacerbated or even caused by your electrolyte strategy is, if you've got a treatment type electrolyte, you need those high levels of sodium like what your product has, which is really at similar levels to what we would propose in our treatment type electrolytes if we were designing them. So you need that high level of sodium in there to replace the losses that are coming in that diarrheic calf in their feces. They're shedding just a lot of sodium from the body. But you really need to stop it after, I would say, 3 days. I like to feed 4 ounces of a high sodium electrolyte twice daily. And you should correct the calf in 1 or 2 days, or 3 at the most. But if it hasn't been corrected at the end of 3 days, you should just stop that treatment type electrolyte product, because you could cause hypernatremia. And it's really, that kind of diarrhea is beyond what the scope of what a treatment type electrolyte is going to be able to solve. So your product has 130 milliosmoles per liter of sodium. We actually recommend sometimes going up to 140, but I really like your level. I think your level might be better than ours. Now I'm going to get into the second type of electrolyte that we encourage you to consider. The preventative type electrolyte need not be expensive. That's designed for a calf during its routine scour period. Like when you bring in a group of calves and none of them are severely diarrheic, but maybe a third or 40% of them, or maybe half of them get a low level of diarrhea, or certainly any day with hot weather. This would be the routine type of electrolyte that you should feed, I would argue, as a midday bottle to drive up fluid intake. And I'm going to get into that and the importance of that and what that can mean to your bottom line and grain intake and getting a calf hydrated during hot climates, when they're residing in hot climates. But then a more treatment type electrolyte, of course, needs a bigger dose. It needs that high level of dextrose. You need that high level of sodium, and it needs to be balanced for strong ion difference, which I didn't get into. That strong ion difference, if you get it corrected, can help correct blood acidemia. The slow drinker is another time when I would start hitting that calf, certainly a moderate type dehydration, maybe as an arrival formula for a long transport calf for just a couple of feedings or one feeding. You can really decide, I think. If it's winter, I'd feed milk replacer upon arrival. If it's hot weather, I would feed a treatment type electrolyte upon arrival. Unless they're not bottle trained, then I would just hit them with hit them with water and then get them on milk right away. But for the severely dehydrated or moderate dehydrated calf, your best strategy is to hit them with a scourge treatment strategy. And if that's not doing the job, after a day or two, I'd hit them with ringers in addition to electrolytes and then stop the treatment type electrolytes after 3 days. A thing I hadn't really gotten into yet, but I would add this to your electrolyte. We've done a lot of work with a sweetener flavor combination. And for these inexpensive electrolytes, it's a great idea because you can really drive up voluntary water intake. This is 8-day-old veal calves, that were placed, long transport calves. A friend of mine that's still in the veal industry, he's my age, and he actually did research at Belgioso when they had a veal feed division. And he's just been a constant thread his whole career in the veal industry. What we did was we just paid him for access to his calves for a midday water feeding. So he feeds his veal calves at with milk replacer at 5:45 a.m. and he comes back in and offers them water then, but then comes back in typically and adds water. But what we did for the study in his 200 head room was every other calf either received plain water, 2 quarts fed at calf body temperature, or 2 quarts of an electrolyte that was just 1 ounce or 25 grams in 2 quarts. And it had this sweetener flavor combination. We do not put these, nor do we want them to have high levels of electrolytes. Obviously, we can't get a lot of dextrose in 1 ounce. This is really a shuttle to get some sweeteners and flavors into there, in addition to providing a low level of glucose and very low level of electrolytes or blood buffers. And you can see the voluntary intake because he would come back an hour later and report or measure on each calf with eyeballing it, whether they consumed 100%, 3/4, half, a quarter, or none, or very little of their electrolyte or water. And you can see that the 100 calves on each, the 77% of the calves that received the electrolyte consumed everything. And if you look on the other end of the spectrum, 25% of the calves that received plain water didn't drink a thing. So we obviously saw a significant difference. This also allowed me to run it through some simple stats in an Excel spreadsheet. And so I captured a p-value using the student t-test of 0.05. And the average intake on that intake score was significantly different. In fact, it was a 30% greater intake if they were fed the electrolyte versus plain water. So this type of a basic electrolyte would just provide a very low level of electrolytes, a maintenance level, I would call it. I would suggest sodium acetate and not sodium bicarb simply because it labels better. There's not going to be a veterinarian who's going to point at this electrolyte and says it has sodium bicarb and then point toward those other 2 studies, the one that was done at Texas Tech and the one done by Dr. Smith at NC State. So it's going to provide a bit of glucose, which I think might be enough in an ounce to raise blood glucoses a little bit, maybe get them up hitting the starter pail after they've consumed the electrolyte solution, which would be good. A little bit of glycine, you could put in there as well. And I failed to mention a treatment type electrolyte. Yours is really high in glycine. I like this. There's actually a lot of World Health Organization work with human infants, in the developing world to show that their hydration went way up if glycine was in their oral rehydration solution. I think there's only one old British nutrition study to show that phenomena occurs in calves, but I think it's reasonable to assume it probably does. I would make it hypotonic, so it's going to be rapidly absorbed. Of course, it's going to be that way when you're only adding 1 ounce per 2 quarts anyway. B vitamins would be a great adjunct to put in there as well. Of course, it needs to be highly water dispersible, but the whole goal is to just promote fluid intake. And why is that so important? Well, there's some data on improving grain intake, and this is obviously well known, but some really nice data to show that correlates water intake with grain intake that was presented last year at dairy science meetings by the University of Guelph, the University of Vermont, and Mapleview Agra in Ontario. But also, of course, during heat stress, and I'm going to show one of Jim Quigley's calf notes that summarizes an oldie but goodie research on that one too. So I really, of all the data last year presented at ADSA, and you know probably that maybe you get, I know you're on the list that gets that review that put together that I'm involved in, but this to me sorted out as the top paper from last year's ADSA summer meetings. And the reason I feel so strongly about that is that it's your one chance here, Ellen, to sell water and how the benefits of water are. And you could do that with just a maintenance type electrolyte that like I'm proposing. And I think it's a great paper for where you're also selling grain in addition to the liquid feeding strategy. But look at this, it was 346 calves, and they were all, I'm going to go to this slide next because this shows their setup. They've got meters and they have both cup and nipple waters in each stall, and so they can measure individual water intake by the method that the water was presented. And you can see their grain. Every time I visited Maple View Agri, and I get there a couple times a year, the grain is always, I would call it kind of perfect grain. It has a bit of fiber and it just always looks good. But getting back to the data, a student at University of Vermont actually chugged a bunch of data on some studies that Mapleview were doing where they were tracking water intake in addition to whatever they were looking at in a nutrition strategy that they were researching at the time. And water was available constantly. They monitored the calves pre and post wean period. They wean at 56 days, so even post wean, so they had 84-day numbers. And they found that for every liter of water consumed over the 84-day period, and the average water intake was right at 364 liters over that 12-week period, the 84-day period. But if they just got one extra liter, they found grain intake increased by ½ pound. So obviously that's very interesting. They also found, which I think was interesting, that every week except week 1, they found this difference. So, and even on week 1, they found a trend, even though there was just such a nominal intake of grain intake week 1. So this isn't just during rumen development. Also, it's not just at weaning. It's throughout the whole 12-week period that this correlation with increased water intake is being associated with increased grain intake. The second one is just using these electrolytes. I think they make a ton of sense in the water losses that are occurring from sweating and from increased respiration that occurs with the calf. And quickly here, just went through an old paper where they actually, in 1981, put these calves in chambers. And they could, I can't recall, I read the paper in addition to his calf note, but there's some very intricate detail on how these folks at this research center measured water loss. And it looked very credible to me. But Jim reported that in this study where the calves were housed at either some temperatures somewhere between 32 and 97 degrees Fahrenheit, that they found that at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the calves with combined respiratory and sweating would lose around 1.7 liters per day from respiring and sweating. And if you went up to 95 degrees, that increased to 6.8. So it's 6.8 minus 1.7 is an extra 5 liters a day of fluids are needed just to meet their respiratory and sweating losses. So this kind of product, we can put them together, Ellen, for less than 10 cents a day. And you could add some features to it to even reach 10 cents a day. So it's something that I think could find its way being fed maybe until the calves get up on grain intake, or certainly during weaning, or I would argue in the summertime, really during the entire period. And it could be a really good investment. It needs more data to prove this correlation in grain intake and water intake on some farms being caused by this electrolyte. But our initial, and we've done I think 6 or 7 of these, and we've continued to find this correlation between putting the sweetener and flavor, in addition to feeding it just electrolyte with dextrose, is strongly preferred over water intake. And we've compared electrolytes with and without these and saw increased voluntary intake. So, and then your high sodium acetate electrolyte would be a step up in your present electrolyte strategy. We already talked about the bacillus, and I sent this data to you in the treatment type product. I think it makes a ton of sense. I'm getting up to the half-an-hour mark. But you need to have an adequate glucose level in it with adequate blood buffer. We, of course, as mentioned, we would stop it after 3 days. But we've also, if you can see our intake with sick calves that were given either an acetate containing electrolyte with or without I say with, comparing that one that contained our sweetener and flavor and 4-ounce feeding rate with high dextrose to just offering plain water, you can see the dramatic difference in voluntary fluid intake. So our electrolyte's going to be way more palatable, and if they have a protocol where they tube the contents that aren't voluntarily consumed of electrolyte solution, they're going to love this electrolyte product. And this is what happened with electrolytes that we made with sodium acetate before we figured out how to do it. That's what it looks like in the center before it got exposed to heat. This is out in the Central Valley of California in September. It was one of the worst sales calls I ever made. We paid for about a half a truckload of electrolytes. And since then, we've sorted this out to where we can make that powder look like it does in the middle, and it can be exposed to that temperature. Out in California or Mexico, or really any of the hot climates that you'd hit, these products have passed the gauntlet of being exposed to those types of temps, and we can do it. So we can have 100% sodium acetate as the blood buffer and not create the things on the left or the right. So in conclusion, we believe in a 2 electrolyte strategy. Your present one is a scour treatment type product. We'd encourage a preventative type strategy. So I've gotten way windier than I expected. I hope to crash through this in 15 minutes. Sorry, Ellen, maybe you didn't even make it this far, but thanks if you have.